Hello, friends. Thanks for tuning in. We're continuing with our explanation summary of this book, Beauty and Imitation. There's a link where you can find this on Word on Fire's website in the description below. Check that out. Don't forget to like and subscribe, especially if this is helping you to understand the book. And so, chapter 4, he's addressing what he calls the Catholic imagination. He's already talked about art as imitating life, ultimately about some protagonist, this story searching for happiness, and then art is telling us whether or not that the value is going to lead towards that search towards happiness, right? And so the next thing that he wants to clarify here is what he means by the Catholic imagination. Basically, how we evaluate true happiness versus despair, the values that we have. That all depends on the nature of the human person, who and what we are, our place in the universe, not just the physical universe, but in the philosophical universe, you could say. And the Catholic teaching, Catholic doctrine, comes with an explanation of that whole set of uh, ideas, where we are, what the nature of true happiness is, the nature of God, and how we relate to Him, and the kinds of choices and values that are going to lead towards ultimately everlasting happiness or everlasting despair. He begins by uh, ultimately saying that the Divine Comedy is the Catholic imagination, because what Dante has done is he's taken the divine imagination, kind of like made it so that we can see it. He gives us the whole geography, you could say, of the Catholic imagination: hell, purgatory, heaven, and all these different kind of protagonists, and you see their lives and how things turned out for them. Ultimately, for Dante, as the protagonist in the whole story, what's going to lead him towards that final glory. So life in the theodrama, he calls it, right? And so he describes McInerny describes the Catholic imagination this way: Catholic imagination is a way of seeing reality through images, a seeing that is informed by Catholic belief, practice, and culture. Okay, and then ultimately, this involves the idea that God is the ultimate protagonist in any human life. That in the end, it's not really just about us, it's about God. McInerny illustrates this with a story from the Divine Comedy where Ulysses, or Odysseus, has his last voyage, right? He's made it home and now he's going to go out again, and he goes and he tries to go beyond. He's going to achieve what no one else has achieved before, and he's going to sail past where anyone else has sailed, and ultimately fails. Right. The whole idea is that he has his own purposes, but they are contrary to God's purposes. And so, in the Catholic imagination, that's ultimately we're trying to align our purposes, our will, with God's will. And he has a quote here. McInerny does, where he says that um, man in his relation to God, the workings of divine purpose, these mysteries which no human being can entirely see or know, or what the Catholic imagination attempts to picture. Right. And so the Catholic imagination, the artist would have one task, but there are two parts to the task. So he says the first task is to distinguish ends and purposes. Remember, we discussed that in an earlier chapter. My purposes are what I want to do. There's human intention behind it, and then the ends are basically what we're made for. Our ends are about our nature, the kind of thing that we are. So distinguishing ends and purposes through a supernatural end, having this sort of supernatural lens on as we look at all of the other types of events and actions in life. And also, the goal is to show the insufficiency of the natural end without the supernatural end. In other words, grace perfecting nature. And so we see Odysseus, he has this goal that he has, but in light of the supernatural end, his goal, his purpose, does not match that supernatural end, and so he results in despair. How is this shown? Through action. He says that a hero takes action, makes a choice, and then choices, those actions, are what drive the plot. Aristotle said that the plot is the soul of a story, the soul of drama. Right? And then thinking about action, right, choices. But if God is the ultimate protagonist, ultimately then it's about God's action, what God is able to do. Um, and especially in, and even in, you could say, even in the small things, the everyday. And these stories are built through the senses. So how do you depict God's action, right? That's you can't really. It's theologically, philosophically, a very thorny kind of thing to do. Even describe, we're recognizing that all of our language is analogical when we talk about God. And so the goal of the artist is to show it, even in very concrete, very everyday, normal types of actions. Again, stories are built through sense impressions, as Fuller O'Connor said. And but even that in the everyday, those are part of God's creation and part of the story that He weaves, and those are stories that we can relate to. Through the senses, we get what you could consider the literal story. But then there are stories that have layers of meaning. There's the literal story, like exactly what's happening, just the plot. Then also how that relates to a higher level. So in the way that Catholicism reads the Bible, there's the literal meaning of Scripture. That's where we start. And then there are allegorical meanings. So when Jesus tells a parable, he's telling a story. And so there's some kind of plot there. But ultimately, there's some type of meaning, higher meaning that he intends in what he's saying. And so that can be true for all art as well, especially Catholic art. He says all the mimetic arts, as employed by the Catholic imagination, use their respective media, their various symbolic languages, to picture the way in which the world of sensible particulars radiates both natural and supernatural meaning. So there's the literal level of the plot, and then there are these other higher levels of meaning that we're trying to get out of a story, and that an artist is trying to portray. And there are some qualifications here. He's talking about the Catholic imagination. That doesn't mean then somehow that, like, if you're not Catholic or it's not a Catholic story, then it's not art. That's ruled out. But um, an artist does not need to be Catholic. Does not even need to be religious, and yet we can still find that meaning in what the artist is trying to portray. He also then, since he's talking about the Catholic imagination, he then talks about the modern imagination. And the modern imagination has been described as either angelic or homeless. So angels don't have bodies, humans have bodies. And stories are told through sense impressions, through the sensible particulars. Um, some modern art has kind of rejected the senses. It's rejected what we can get through sight, through sound. And we're trying just to get to the feelings, right? And just talk about the feelings themselves, and just as expression of what's inside of us, and that's called romanticism. It's a rejection of the bodily nature that we have as human beings, and also homelessness. A lot of modern art, there's a kind of nihilism, a sort of meaninglessness, a sort of purposelessness to the art, and the art is showing that. And yet, I mean, I would say that when we look at that kind of art, some of these plays like Waiting for Godot, then it does sort of express the the despair of that kind of viewpoint. You can't help, but that's part of what the art is telling us is like they may be taking it seriously as saying that this is the way the world is, but then we can look at that and say, okay, well, what's the encounter that that produces in us? So. Uh, that was the chapter on the Catholic imagination. Ultimately, that art, the way it's portrayed, the way that we look at it, can be seen through this Catholic perspective on the meaning of human life and man's relation to God. Thanks for watching. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the links in the description below.